When I meet young people, I've got two ways of knowing if they're vulnerable to making really poor choices in life. The first one is the failing education. So if I'm talking to young people and they're saying they hate school, they're never in school, they've been kicked out of school, is a huge warning sign to me, because I know they're vulnerable now to being pulled into criminality, making negative choices. And the other warning sign is, I've no father at home. And if you've got both of them, then you're extremely vulnerable to making poor choices.
The dark woods off Florida's highways. It was down dirt roads like this that 7 men met the madness of one angry woman. Lee Wuornos murdered them, robbed them, and then drove home in their cars.
Those men were shot, just shot in self-defense, boom, boom, boom. They weren't cut up, they weren't sliced up, no OJ jazz, And he said, I did the most horrendous crime in the whole wide world.
Not true?
I guess not. All they were was shot and left. If it was a horrendous crime, why didn't I shoot them between the eyes, cut their penis off, stick it in their mouth, do all kinds of gross stuff? All they were was shot and left,
She's been called the damsel of death and the hooker from hell.
Let me begin my confessions to you with when I was a child.
Eileen was born February 29th, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, 26 miles north of Detroit. She seemed destined for a life of turmoil. Her parents, Diane and Leo Pittman, had a violent and tumultuous marriage. They had eloped in January 1954, when Diane was just 14.
Diane was very young when she fell in love with Leo, who was a bit of a bad lot. Certainly her father and mother did not approve of this liaison, but the next thing you know, they're married.
The newlyweds' first child, Keith, was born in March 1955. Soon after, Leo was arrested for a variety of petty crimes. To avoid prison, he was allowed to enlist in the Army. He left home, and Diane took the opportunity to flee. 7 months later, she gave birth to Eileen. Diane abandoned Eileen and Keith and would never reclaim them. Eileen would never meet her father.
Psychologists sketch a portrait of a damaged person with a lurid history of abuse that began in childhood. Abandoned by her teenage mother when she was just 6 months old, Lee was raised by her alcoholic grandmother and a cruel grandfather who regularly beat her with his belt buckle. When she was 2, her father committed suicide in jail, where he was doing time for kidnapping and raping a child. By 13, she'd been raped and was pregnant. At 14, she quit school. And when her grandfather kicked her out of home, Lee Wuornos' life on the road began.
When it comes to serial child killer Albert Fish, the adjectives to describe his inhumanity hardly seem strong enough. Depraved, perverted, deviant, degenerate. He was all of that, but he was much more. The crimes he committed fill the heart with rage, while the taunting letters he sent the victims' families make you wonder how a human being could possibly be so cruel.
Long before Hannibal Lecter, fictional cannibal, there was a man the tabloids labeled both the Gray Man and the Werewolf of Wisteria. He was a true-life cannibal, a living monster. Born into a respectable family in Washington, D.C. in 1870, Albert Fish's immediate family had a history of mental illness and alcoholism. A few of his relatives had perished in mental institutions. At the age of 5, Fish's father died. His mother was forced to work and was unable to care for him. So Fish was sent to an orphanage. Here, Fish recalls, I saw so many boys whipped, it took root in my head.
Hamilton Howard Albert Fish was born on May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C. His father, Randall, was 75 years old when he was born, being 43 years older than his mother, Ellen. The old man died when Albert was 5 years old, and the children, they were placed into an orphanage. At the orphanage, Albert sang in the choir. He was also subjected to merciless beatings by other boys, as well as even staff members. The physical pain of the beatings and the whippings, he came to realize, gave him a sort of sexual pleasure.
Authorities believe Coleman began his spree of murder and rape at the end of May, when he allegedly abducted 2 little girls in Gary, Indiana. One just raped and beat, the other he also murdered.
She had multiple contusions about her. She had a cord around her neck, and she had a footprint on her chest, and her right hand was tied with evidently a piece of her shirt.
The day after 7-year-old Tamika Turks was found in Gary, the body of another child, 9-year-old Vernita Weed, was found in Kenosha, Wisconsin. The 9-year-old was the daughter of a woman Coleman had become friends with.
He will go into neighborhoods in order to get whatever items he needs for survival. This is independent of his effort to obtain young black girls for his deviant purposes.
But Coleman is also suspected of killing adults. The body of 25-year-old evangelist Donna Williams was found in an abandoned Detroit building last week. She'd been missing since June 19th, shortly after she met Coleman.
Alton grew up with his grandmother. His mother had abandoned him as a young child. He grew up in a very low-income area of Waukegan.
To make ends meet, Alton's grandmother ran a brothel and gambling parlor out of her home. From a young age, Alton acts out antisocial behaviors, including breaking windows in the housing projects where he lives.
Without the encouragement of your father, man, the world is a dismal place. It's very difficult to be a courageous person unless you have your father in body and spirit behind you. It's very demoralizing. Like, it really kills people not to have their mother. They just don't recover from that. And I think people can recover from a fragmented father relationship, but it's the next worst thing. You know, because if your father rejects you or doesn't form a relationship with you, it's as if the spirit of civilization has left you outside the walls as of little worth. It's very difficult for people to recover from that.
He began with that clenched fist salute. He looked composed and unemotional as the prosecution read out the details of the 77 people he had killed. The only time Anders Behring Breivik was moved to tears was when his own anti-immigrant manifesto appeared on the screens in court. A court whose authority he refused to recognize. The first day of the murder trial in Oslo was an unsettling affair, as Carl Dinham now reports.
Anders Behring Breivik, demented fascist or cold rational killer? Breivik smiled as he entered court this morning, then offered the waiting media some kind of salute. Mad or bad, these 5 judges must decide, even though Breivik's first words were to deny their legitimacy.
I do not recognize the Norwegian court. You've gotten your mandate from political parties who support multiculturalism.
But there's no denying the horror Breivik sowed across Norway last summer. And he admits shooting terrified young activists on the island of Utøya. He admits the huge bomb in Oslo.
Anders Behring Breivik was born on February 13, 1979, in Oslo, Norway. His father was a diplomat for the Norwegian embassy in London, and his mother was a nurse. He spent the first year of his life in London, after which his parents divorced and his mother took him to Norway.
His childhood was marked by the divorce of his parents and worrying behavior that would draw the attention of the authorities at a very young age.
He was under observation by a child psychiatrist when he was at the age of 3 or 4 years old. And they all gave him a quite serious diagnosis that he was already a different psychiatric setup than normal kids.
At the age of 4, Breivik was assessed by psychologists because they became quite concerned about the home life his mother was bringing him up in. They thought that he'd been sexualized in some way and that his mother was projecting her own ideas onto him that weren't appropriate for a 4-year-old boy.
The family unit would quickly begin to dissolve, leaving Anders in the care of his increasingly unstable mother and isolated from his father.
I think Breivik's father is present mostly in the form of his absence. You know, he was not there for Breivik.
He certainly didn't have much of a family to live with.
Bonnie and Clyde had been on a 2-year crime spree that left a trail of dead bodies in their wake. They were little more than a local curiosity until photos of the couple were discovered at a crime scene in 1933. Overnight, the country became transfixed by the scandalous images, press accounts of improbable escapes, and their illicit romance. Smack dab in the middle of Texas, in the small town of Rowena, Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1st, 1910. 4 years later, after her father's unexpected death, Bonnie's mother, Emma, moved the family not far from the slums of West Dallas. Despite the impoverished conditions, Emma made sure to raise her 3 children with the knowledge that they were somehow better than their surroundings.
Charles Manson and his so-called family would become the most infamous killers of the 20th century.
The victims died in the worst way.
Committing a series of brutal and seemingly senseless crimes that would spell the end of the 1960s hippie dream.
They were vicious, just horrible killings. It's multiple stabbing while people are begging for their lives.
But what made Manson the man he was?
He was a very powerful person. When he said jump, they jumped.
How did so many young people fall under his spell?
Charlie would talk about how he was Jesus and the devil all in one.
Over 2 nights in August 1969, actress Sharon Tate and 6 others had been slain in one of the century's most infamous crimes. The killers were a group of young, seemingly middle-class flower children, acting on behalf of their spiritual leader, 35-year-old ex-convict Charles Manson. But just who was this powerful guru?
Manson was to have been born as an unwanted, illegitimate child of a young prostitute.
Disowned at birth, pretty much, raised by relatives.
He grew up in some very tight situation.
It's been claimed that Manson's mother once tried to sell her infant son to a childless waitress in return for a pitcher of beer.
From an early age, he was left to his own devices, got involved in delinquent/criminal activities.
When you grow up on the street, particularly if you're short and slight, like Manson is, you have to be able to learn how to read people very, very quickly and determine who you can get over on and who you can't. And Manson was excellent at that.
From the mid-1940s onwards, a raft of thefts and armed robberies would see the young Manson pass through several institutions where he was said to be sexually brutalized.
Unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets. that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created.
David Koresh was a monster. He was a highly unstable, self-proclaimed Messiah who used the Bible and used scriptures as a weapon.
It's war. These governments of this world are coming to an end.
He always said that they would come for us, and we were going to defend ourselves, and we were all going to die.
He was an embodiment of evil. He was the complete, absolute dictator of every facet of everyone's life.
I'm learning the truth.
Do you think he's the Son of God? Yeah. He had uncommonly powerful capacities to manipulate people and instantaneously decay souls.
He was the self-proclaimed Messiah who looked like a rock star. A mesmerizing personality and passionate Bible knowledge combined to allow him to gain ascendancy over a small group of followers, to manipulate them, use them for his sexual desires, and prepare them for his own version of Armageddon.
His mother was very young when he was born, 15.
He had a very troublesome childhood. His mother had been married 3 times. He wasn't particularly the best student in school. He had some learning disabilities.
Vernon Wayne Howell, the child who would become David Koresh, was born on August 17, 1959 in Houston, Texas. His mother, Bonnie Clark, was just 14 at the time, while his father, carpenter Bobby Howell, was a 20-year-old drifter who abandoned his pregnant girlfriend when another girl caught his eye. Bonnie soon took up with a man who was a violent drunk. They were married, with the union lasting for just 2 years. They proved to be tortuous years for the infant, who would often recall in later life how his stepfather mistreated him.
Thank you, Michael, and hello. Dennis Nielsen, the man who once called himself the murderer of the century, tonight starts a life sentence for 6 murders in North London. He once boasted he could have killed 500 people had he not been stopped. The judge at the Old Bailey said he should stay in prison for at least 25 years. Nielsen, a 37-year-old civil servant, showed no emotion as sentence was passed. He denied murdering 6 young men between 1980 and 1982. He admitted killing them and maybe 9 more and cutting up their bodies at houses where he lived in Cricklewood and Muswell Hill. But Nielsen claimed it was manslaughter because of diminished responsibility. 8 or even 9 of his victims to this day remain unidentified. Young men with no names, no known addresses, jobless, rootless, and friendless. Some were Scots, some were Irish, others were described as vagrants, hippies, and skinheads. And as Stephen Chambers now reports, there are many more just like them, alone in London tonight.
Dennis Nielsen was born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, a remote fishing community in northeast Scotland. His mother's family had lived there for generations. His father was a visiting Norwegian soldier.
He was one of 3 children, the middle child. He had an older brother, a younger sister. He never really knew his father.
Nielsen, as a child, was a bit of a loner.
He didn't really have friends because everybody thought he was a bit odd. His mother said she could never cuddle him. He didn't have tactile relationships with anyone except his grandfather.
Nielsen's father is absent from the household, and so he had formed a bond with his grandfather. They would walk together, fish together, and so forth.
The boy's grandfather would often be away for weeks at a time, trawling the fishing grounds of the North Sea.
One day, he came home from school, and his mother said to him, "Oh, do you want to see your granddad?" He said, oh, he didn't know he was there even. So he was very pleased about that, and he went into the kitchen, and there on the kitchen table was a long box, and in it was his grandfather. Nobody had prepared him for the fact that he was dead.
Nielsen's grandfather had died at sea, and his corpse had been brought home for burial.
He had this picture in his mind imprinted of seeing his grandfather white as a sheet, and I think that affected him deeply.
Neilson would later say that when he saw his grandfather laid out in the front sitting room after his grandfather's death, that this was when Neilson first began to associate love with death, an inert body.
From that moment, I'm convinced, I can't prove it, but I'm convinced that his idea of love and his idea of death fused and became linked, inextricably linked.
Our viewers know you, I think, like many viewers across the country, many Americans, because of the movie and the fame that you've achieved from Catch Me If You Can, from a book you wrote that was turned into a movie, a Broadway play, a television series that talked about your early life as a forger, con artist, and really a criminal. But welcome to Wyoming Chronicle.
Thank you, glad to be here.
You bet. You're here because you're assisting AARP Wyoming and AARP nationally to give good advice to people to protect themselves from fraud and from criminal imposters like you were at one time in your life. And we're going to get to many tips that you have for our viewers here in just a little bit.
Sure.
But before we begin, take us back, Frank, if you would, to the time when in your life when you were 16 years old. You need to you made some decisions that were family-based, and you were on your own, and you began a short life as a criminal.
Yeah, when I was 16 years old, my parents separated, and I found myself in a courtroom with my parents and the judge telling me that I had to decide which parent I was going to live with. And as a 16-year-old boy, I couldn't do that. I couldn't find a way to do that, so I ran out of the courtroom, and I ended up as a runaway in New York City.
On the 26th of April, a funeral was held at Golders Green Crematorium in North London. Mrs. Molly Young had died suddenly, apparently from the after effects of a recent accident. She had been found 5 days earlier, writhing in agony in the garden of their home on a North Circular Road by her husband Fred when he returned for lunch. Fred Young had also found his 14-year-old son Graham watching his stepmother through the kitchen window, apparently too stunned with shock to raise the alarm. Molly Young was rushed to hospital, but doctors could not save her, and she died that afternoon. Graham was very insistent that his stepmother should be cremated quickly, and his distraught family agreed to this in the hope of sparing Fred Young any further misery. At the reception afterwards, one of Graham's uncles began vomiting after adding some pickle to a sandwich. These were not the first illnesses to plague the Youngs' household. Molly Young's stomach pains had begun several months before. And when Fred Young also suffered severe cramps, he had wondered whether chemicals from young Graham's chemistry experiments were contaminating their cooking utensils. Unknown to the Youngs, one of Graham's school friends, Chris Williams, had also suffered cramp in his legs and chest and severe headaches. Chris's pains had become so severe that he had also been taken to the Willesden General Hospital, where doctors diagnosed a severe migraine. One morning in November 1961, Graham's sister Winifred had set off for work. She had found her breakfast tea tasted bitter and only drank a mouthful. During the journey, she collapsed and was taken to the Middlesex Hospital. After making tests, doctors decided that Winifred had taken belladonna, a poison extracted from the deadly nightshade plant. When she was released from the hospital, Winifred accused her brother of being careless with his chemical experiments. He vehemently denied this. Both children had had a somewhat disturbed childhood when their mother died of pleurisy shortly after Graham's birth. Winifred was sent to her grandmother, while Graham was looked after by Fred's sister. The family was reunited when Fred Young remarried in 1950, but he never became close to his son, as Graham's uncle Frank Walker recalls.
His father, as far as I knew, had no time for him whatsoever. He never, well, what can I say, he never cherished him as he should do or anything like that.
Graham grew up an awkward, solitary child. But he was bright enough to pass the 11+ exam and get a place at the John Kelly High School. There he appeared bored by any subject other than his obsession, chemistry, and in particular the study of poisons. Graham started borrowing books on medicine and poisons, and his family caught him with bottles which he admitted to having stolen from the dustbins of local chemists. By the time he was 13, Graham was an expert on poisons and their effects. He was also showing some other rather disturbing obsessions.
I've been round to the house, and his wife, who is his stepmother, his late stepmother, she showed me photos of what he'd drawn of coffins with R.I.P. and death's head and all that kind of thing. She used to show, and she said, "What do you think of these kind of things?" So I said, "Well, your boy, isn't he?"
Graham was open in his admiration for William Palmer, the Victorian poisoner who killed some 13 people, and for Dr. Crippen, who had murdered his wife with hyoscine in 1910.
Between the summer of 1963 and the autumn of 1965, something terrible happened here that shocked the nation. It would come to forever define this stretch of moorland on the outskirts of Manchester as a place touched by evil. 5 children, all abducted, tortured and murdered. All but one of them buried here in the marshy peat bogs of Saddleworth Moor. Their killers, with their blank faces, would become instantly recognisable as the killer couple, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley.
He was an illegitimate child, which at the time was something that marked people's personalities. If you were a bastard, today we use the word almost without thinking, but in those days, if you were born out of wedlock, it affected your personality. That was just the beginning, though. He was raised in Glasgow, in the Gorbals, which was a tough neighbourhood. He was subjected to the usual things that tearaway kids experienced at the time.
A week ago today, little James Bulger disappeared while shopping with his mother in the Bootle Strand shopping precinct. 2 youths were seen walking him away. His body was found 2 days later on a railway line in Walton near Liverpool. Today, the police investigating the murder announced a breakthrough in their inquiries.
Following the abduction of James Bulger from the New Strand shopping precinct in Bootle on Friday the 12th of February 1993, and the subsequent findings of his body on the railway line in Walton on Sunday the 14th of February, 2 boys aged 10 years from Walton area have been arrested and are currently being interviewed by Merseyside police at police stations on Merseyside.
There are hundreds of child offenders in Britain, and there are clear patterns in their background. One study suggested that 3/4 of them came from a broken home, a third had been in care, and 1 in 5 had a low IQ. One of Albert Kirby's first jobs on the James Bulger case was to investigate the backgrounds of the boys charged with the murder.
When we looked at the history of the 2 boys, there were suggestions that Venables had been the subject of bullying at school. In fact, one of those that were bullying him at one period of time was Thompson, but they became friends, and we know certainly the year up to before the murder, they were regular truants from school, always coming out and being involved in petty shoplifting, that type of thing. In Venables' case, mother and father were separated, but had joint care for the children.
Kids who lack fathers, I mean, first of all, they can find that to some degree in their friends. And that's often what fatherless boys do in particular. They go into gangs, and they generate the missing masculinity in the gang. Well, that's not so good, because like, what the hell do they know? They don't know anything, right? They're just stupid kids, and they're like 15 years old, and their testosterone is pumping, and they're trying to get the hell away from their mother, which is what they're supposed to do. And they're not in the right position to exercise any authority over themselves. So that's not good. But it's very, very difficult to not have a father. Right. And you know, one of the things that we're doing in our society, which I think it's absolutely appalling, is that we're making the case that all families are equal. It's like, sorry, no, wrong. And there's no empirical data supporting that proposition, by the way. It's much better for kids to have two parents. Okay. Now, who those parents are, that's a whole different issue. And like, I really do think that it's the sign of the degeneration of a society when single parenthood becomes anything approximating the norm. It's not a good idea. And part of the reason I believe that, and I think this has to do with the overwhelming selfishness of modern life, is that marriage isn't for the people who are married. It's for the children, obviously. And like, if you can't handle that, grow the hell up.
A London MP has said that most of the young people who commit knife crime in his constituency don't have a father around to guide them. David Lammy made the comments at the Labour Party conference in Manchester.
In the catalogue of crime, there is no more abhorrent in the eyes of the law and the public than the murder of a child. When you add a sexual motive, police will leave no stone unturned in the search for the killer. But one such paedophiliac murderer remained at large for many years. He carried out grotesque acts of indecency against his young victims and dumped their bodies in various locations across the UK. On a hot Friday afternoon in July 1982, an 11-year-old girl was walking back to her home in Northumberland. She'd been playing tennis in the town of Coldstream in the borders between Scotland and England. But young Susan Maxwell never made it home. She fell prey to Robert Black. Her sudden disappearance horrified Scotland.
A little girl walking home from a tennis game on a summer's afternoon in a beautiful part of the Scottish borders where crime doesn't happen. You know, it wasn't some sort of inner city gang thing. It was, you know, it really brought home to people. It was the sort of destruction of innocence of really that part of Scotland.
Your mother, Robert. Tell me about your mother.
I never knew my mother. She abandoned me when I was a kid. Didn't even know my father's name.
It's very far from the ideal start in life, and pretty well every denominator of successful, stable personality development was not exactly there for him.
What sounded like automatic gunfire rang out late Sunday night, the bullets spraying into a crowd of roughly 22,000 concertgoers on the Las Vegas Strip. These videos captured the chaos unfolding on the ground. There was confusion about where the bullets were coming from, or even if they were bullets.
Not a gun. Not a gun.
Some were frozen in panic. Others fled for their lives.
And all of a sudden we heard pop, 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 countless of times, and we all thought it was firecrackers. And then it kept on going, and then he quiet for a bit, then he fired another 15, 20 rounds, and that's when he realized it was a fully automatic.
Police say the gunshots came from above.
There was an active shooter that was firing rounds from the 32nd floor. We are still going through the search warrant actively at this time, but it's in excess of 10 rifles.
The suspect is now dead, and authorities are still trying to piece together the scope of the carnage.
Your father was a bank robber?
That's correct.
I mean, here, we're all proud. My father was on the top 10 list for a while. His name's Benjamin Hotchkiss Paddock, I believe is his name. I didn't know him. We didn't know him. He was in jail and broken out of jail. I mean, my mom was born in the Depression. She's had a tough life. Her husband was a total hole. He ran off, left her with 4 kids. She raised 4 kids on a secretary salary in the 60s and 70s. And some of us weren't real good kids. I mean, you guys are probably going to investigate me. I wasn't a wonderful human being when I was a kid. We were bad kids, okay? That's, at some level. We were troublesome kids. We grew up poor on the side of the freeway in the San Fernando Valley in California.
Unless there's a last-minute stay, at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, they'll throw the switch on the electric chair at Florida State Prison, and finally, the tragic, twisted saga of Ted Bundy will be over.
He is an affront to civilized society. He decided that he was not going to play by anybody's rules, that he wanted to kill, and he was going to kill, and he was going to continue killing.
He's convicted of 3 murders, but authorities think he actually killed 36 and perhaps many more.
Ted Bundy was born into poverty and never knew his father. He had good grades in school, but an unmanageable temper. At the age of 16, he became a voyeur, obsessed with masturbating. Who would have known that Bundy would become a serial murderer, and yet he killed many women?
The other point that's key is that what's very clear is that children get worse life chances when they're growing up in poverty, and we would like to see much more support given to all families where they're growing up in financial difficulty.
That's the point, isn't it? If you're in a single parent household, you're far, far more likely to grow up in poverty, and a lot of deadbeat dads come from a situation where they weren't parented by their dad, so don't have an example to follow. It's about how you set a culture, and men need a role.
Timothy McVeigh, guilty. Guilty of murder, guilty of conspiracy, guilty on all 11 federal charges that he faced in the Oklahoma City bombing trial. His conviction comes a little more than 2 years after a massive bomb shattered the Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people, including 19 children.
Young Timothy was the middle child in a household that was as boring as it was dysfunctional. His father, Bill, worked endless shifts to support his family, while his mother, Mickey, divided her time between going on the road for work and going on the road with other men. Years later, Tim would say that he and his sisters, Patty and Jennifer, saw almost nothing of their parents growing up. Not that the children were isolated good Catholics from Irish stock. The McVeighs were fixtures at the local church and generally lived the sort of lives you'd expect from small-town nobodies. When Mickey finally left in 1978 and took Patsy and Jennifer to live in Florida, it was just another chapter in that American classic, The Great Big Book of Suburban Misery. For 10-year-old Tim, being left alone with Dad Bill effectively meant being left entirely alone.
1 million children in Britain are growing up with barely any male influence in their lives, thanks to the increase in single-parent families and the lack of male teachers at primary schools.
A study from the Centre for Social Justice found that in some parts of the country, 3 in 4 families were headed by just one parent, while 80% of primary schools have fewer than 3 male teachers.
Got this emergence of, in certain parts of the country, kind of men deserts, where children are growing up and they don't really see many male role models through the younger years.
We're not allowed to talk about this, because if you talk about this, it's as if we're attacking single mums. And I'm not attacking single mums. Do an amazing job under so much pressure and stress. What I'm saying is they'd be under less pressure and stress and have an easier life if we had the father there. And who I'm blaming are the fathers. I'm not blaming the single mums. I'm saying to men and boys, how dare you knock somebody up and it's your child and you take no responsibility ever for your child? Then how dare you do that? This is your flesh and blood growing inside, this woman who's then going to give birth. It's going to be your child who's then going to have other children, and you don't want to be part of their life, and you don't want to provide for that child and be a man and take responsibility. How dare you not want to do that? And you're going to leave it to the state to bring up your child. I'll tell you what, the state will do a bloody poor job of bringing up your child, a poor job. You need to get some responsibility and you need to raise your own children. That's what you need to do. And that's aimed at the men, not at single mums who do a good job under hard circumstances. I want them to have more help and support. And it's the men, as a society, we need to be going after and saying, just like we used to do with drink driving. When I was a kid in the 70s, I always went to my uncle's car who was drunk and we'd drive us home. And we all knew he was drunk and it was acceptable. Now, you'd phone the police if you knew someone was driving someone's kids home. You'd phone the police. And that's what we need to do with men who are not taking responsibility for their children. Children need a father and a mother. In less exceptional circumstances. If your dad's a violent, murdering paedophile, do you know what? You'll do better in life without having a relationship with him. So that's a caveat. But on the whole, children need both parents.
So that BLM recommendation, not constructive, not helpful. That's
disastrous.
Disastrous. Okay.
Yeah.
Because these things have become unsayable.
Yeah. I was a teacher in East London, a very deprived part of East London in Newham. And I looked at the boys who were struggling in my class and I'd be like, no, dad, no, dad, no, dad, no, dad. Yes. The vast majority of them. And it's not their fault, those kids. It's because, as you said, they've been failed by their fathers. And people don't want to say this, but if you have a kid, that is your responsibility.
Your responsibility? We can't say it enough.
Yeah.
It's your responsibility. And men who abandon their children should be publicly shamed. You should be ashamed of sitting in the pub and saying, oh yeah, I've got 2 kids. Oh yeah, I've not seen them in years. That should be like saying, well, yeah, I did 4 years in jail for paedophilia. It should be almost the same as that because you're damaging your own children. You might not see it and it goes a long time and it's emotional, but you're damaging your own flesh and blood.